والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to part 2 of our series with Coach Said Ismail. And in our last episode that aired on Tuesday, the 4th of November, we began a conversation that was honest, in-depth, and for many deeply personal. Now, at the time of recording this, we're not aware of your feedback or how you've taken to that series, so do drop us an email so that we can know more about that and other topics you'd like us to cover. You could drop us an email to the general account. It's hana@radioislamlive.com. We spoke about topics like emotional defensiveness. We spoke about that fear that comes up for people. And today we're going to continue exploring more powerful questions. If you joined us for part 1 and you're back for part 2, then congratulations. You're lifting that shield of defensiveness if it was difficult in our past interviews with Coach Said. Coach, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to part 2 of the series, and thank you so much for joining us.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. I'm just having a bit of a chuckle at your comment about the defensiveness, because that's unfortunately such a frequent experience, is that people get defensive when you're trying to just have a meaningful conversation about something that's important.
It is the case, isn't it? And I'm wondering how much of that has to do with the fact that our culture and society looks down on reflection and critical thinking. In part 1, you mentioned that towards the close. There were some powerful closing statements you had, and one of them was about that, right? Where in our culture and society, as much as Islam advocates and encourages, and even more than encourage, it asks you, compels you to reflect, to think, to be the people of insight, right? The ulul albab. Culturally, we're not open to that. We are very closed off to that. We see it as an attack on ourselves, an attack on our parenting, as we spoke about in part 1. And there's just so much of defensiveness that we can't, we actually lose sight of who we are meant to be in our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to an extent.
I think it's a really critical issue that we're facing, and in fact I would go as far as saying that that's probably at the heart of the problems that we're facing as an ummah and as a community as well, because we operate on, if I had to kind of distill it down to a single statement, I would say that as a community and as individuals who try to take the lead from our elders, so to speak, we operate on a very low trust, high fear basis. Everything is about, you're not allowed to trust yourself. You have to do it this way. So even if you're going to reflect, you must reflect the way I tell you to reflect, not how you feel naturally inclined towards reflection. And if you're going to understand and implement something, you have to implement it the way I'm telling you to implement it, not the way it resonates with you within the context of your specific circumstance. So you're not allowed to think for yourself, and then at the same time you're held accountable for what you think. And this is completely contradictory to Islamic wisdom.
Yeah. It is. It just sounded so ridiculous. Just hearing it said out loud, because it is ridiculous. Where even the way we reflect, we need to reflect as the way we're expected to, or the way we're taught to reflect. It just, gosh, it's, when you said that, I thought, really, that's exactly what we are doing, and we don't even realize it. Or do we? Do we realize it and just choose to ignore it?
I think it's well intentioned, because we believe that we're protecting them from Jahannam by not letting them go astray and things like that. But we don't realize that Allah guides whom He chooses, right? So we're not responsible for someone else's guidance. We're only responsible for ensuring that we advise them sincerely and truthfully. And if Nuh alayhi salam could have a son who rejected his message, then we shouldn't, through compliance and brute force, try to ensure that our children are going to follow our advice and guidance. So that's why the fear and the low trust then results in other problems. And that's where we end up with the kind of ridiculousness that we've got now, where everything is a mental illness, because we don't see how we sow the seeds and we entrench the thinking that's based on compliance and a lack of faith and trust in how things work. and more from a perspective of you have to make things happen a certain way or else. And that just destroys the opportunity for healthy, meaningful, deep conversations, because between a father and a son, or even any parent and their child, you can't have those conversations anymore because you've got this massive thing in front of you about how you don't tell me, I'm telling you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. When we, coming back to the topic, when we look at formative experiences and emotional wounds, um, help us understand this a bit more in terms of the character traits or tendencies. There's emotional vulnerability, and then there's the inflated ego. How different are these two, or how similar do you see them to be?
I think the one is a consequence of the other. So an inflated ego is just a greater number of insecurities at play. And emotional vulnerability is how we feel if we don't embellish those insecurities. So one of my favorite topics is talking about the ego, because it's so misunderstood. And again, it's because of this traditional approach to defining the ego that is based on nafs and all of that sort of thing. It's not. Your ego is the sum total of your insecurities. The more insecure you are as an individual, the more egotistically you behave, because you have to be more loud. You have to be louder in your character, in your approach. You have to be more in your face about letting people recognize how much you do and what you're capable of and how much you've accomplished and everything else. And that comes across as arrogance and egotistical behavior. But meanwhile, the only reason you're doing it is because you believe that if they don't see that about you, they're not going to appreciate exactly how awesome you are. So emotional vulnerability is not having that to embellish your character, because you already believe that your character is not enough.
Right. So in terms of the ego, would your book, The Ego System, be something you'd refer our listeners to get a deeper understanding of what you mean?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that was the inspiration behind it, right? Is that we can't just write things off to this kind of mystical force that we're contending with all our life. We have to have something more substantial to work with so that we can actually do something meaningful about it. And the ego system effectively distills down to its core elements what it is that creates that insecurity in the first place. And once you understand how that insecurity is created within you, it's not something that's created because of what's happening around you. It's within you. It's your belief that you have about your ability to navigate something or to acquire something that is important to you, or to have the impact that you want to have. When you understand how that plays out, you can then hold yourself to account, and you can check yourself when you're making incorrect assumptions and you're jumping to wrong conclusions, and your behavior is sporadic because it's out of fear instead of being more purposeful and things like that. So that mindfulness, which is another contentious point, which is also then at the core of this narcissistic behavior that we seem to have a problem with. Mindfulness is your ability to be present in that moment, consciousness, taqwa, being there in the moment, not taking your negative experiences of the past, your childhood trauma and your abuse and everything else, and projecting it on the present moment because you're afraid of what's going to happen in the future if you don't do that. So to be able to achieve that state then becomes the challenge, right? Which is why taqwa is emphasized so much throughout the Quran and Hadith, right? It's the mindfulness, it's the consciousness you have about how you are bringing yourself to bear on a situation that you're going to be accountable for. And if you're not aware of that, you could be counterproductive to the very things that you claim you're fighting so dearly to want to achieve, especially in your home, with your family, with your partner, with your children, whatever it is. You'll be counterproductive because you'll be almost trying to beat kindness into someone. It doesn't work.
So the book that you're talking about, listeners, is coach's website. You go to zaidisma.com and then the category under books, and you'll find it listed there, and you're able to preview it and purchase your copy from there. On the website directly, it's called The Ecosystem, the Heart of the Human Experience. When we talk about different tools that support people who are ready to grow, let go of this defensiveness and this fear, and to really get to know their own selves, how important do you find these techniques or tools, journaling, coaching, therapy, how important are they in helping a person reconnect with empathy and a sense of emotional responsibility?
I think those tools are somewhat neutral relative to what you're looking to achieve with it. Because a lot of people say go and journal, right? But what are you journaling for? Are you journaling to validate how you feel about yourself and your life? Are you journaling to unpack your train of thought so that you can give it substance? What's the purpose behind your journaling? What's the purpose behind your therapy, behind your counseling? And that's where we run into problems, is that if we don't hold ourselves accountable for what we're looking to get from that effort, we're going to automatically assume that we're doing the work and everyone else must just give us a break. So if you're going to journal about everything that's bleeding heart kind of victim mentality, talking about how no one understands you and life is so bad, and create some alternate fantastical romantic world in your books, in your writing, understand that that's what you're doing. It's not going to solve your real life problems. It's not going to give you a better understanding of why you feel that way. It's not going to give you a better understanding of why it is that others experience you in a way that you don't want them to experience you. So just journaling in itself doesn't help. You have to have mindfulness with it. You have to be able to reflect on it and keep yourself honest about, what am I actually journaling? Am I feeling sorry for myself? Am I stroking my own ego? What am I doing with it? And then if you're journaling because you're trying to unpack this clutter you've got going on in your head, then there's benefit in it. Because sometimes when you just speak something out, you give it a substance and you give it a shape and a form that you can actually work with. And how often don't we go through those times where we have these thoughts, and then when we actually express it to someone else, an idea or something, then we think, oh my God, that's so ridiculous. What was I thinking, right? That's the purpose of something like journaling, is to self-evaluate, but honestly, with objective reflection about it. But if you're going to just do it because you think you're so awesome and you need to capture these thoughts because no one else is going to appreciate it, and that's your private little shame that you're going to protect from the world and all of that, then you're not doing yourself any favors. You're not helping yourself grow. You're not helping yourself heal if you need to heal, whatever it is. We have to be more purposeful.
So even in using these tools or techniques, being purposeful, being mindful about it. Now, ownership of our behavior, taking that ownership, that's a big one for you. How do we go about actually inviting someone to take ownership of their behavior without resorting to that blame game or the shame that we put people through?
I think we have to always redirect attention to what is the merit of what it is that we're pointing out versus the merit of what they claim they're trying to achieve. So if someone says, I'm just trying to create a good life for us, and your gripe with them is that the way you're going about doing it is actually making things more unpleasant for us, I can't just leave it at that. I have to be able to substantiate it. I have to give them something to work with so that they can realize that, listen, we trust your sincerity, your good intention, but you have to realize that this is how we're experiencing it. So how do we find a middle ground here? How do we make sure that we can appreciate and enjoy the efforts that you're putting in to create this life for us, so that you feel appreciated and we actually experience the benefit of it? And sometimes it's that the person who might be doing all of that effort, they might see something that the others don't, right? And that's where it gets really difficult, is that if people are not on the same level of awareness and understanding, then automatically you're going to have one person who feels very strongly about why they have to do this, and the other person feeling very strongly why that's just unnecessary. And if neither of them stop to pause and reflect and consider, okay, how it's intended is not how it's being received, they're going to keep assuming that this person just wants it their way or that person just wants it their way. We don't hold ourselves accountable. If we hold ourselves accountable, it won't feel like an attack when someone else asks us to be accountable.
What would you say are the first signs when someone is starting to move away from self-image management and then moving towards a more authentic connection with others?
You know, for some
I
reason,
think many people are trying to see, like, am I moving in that direction? Is that the direction I need to be in?
okay, here's another contentious view that probably won't earn me any favors. The moment I'm focused on my image, I'm focused on what I want others to think of me, not what I think of myself. Which means that that's a very narcissistic trait. Right? So, you know, it reminds me of people like, and just off the top of my head, Dr. Gabor Mate. Gabor Mate is also a very well-respected psychiatrist, also a Holocaust survivor who's also pro-Palestine, who talks about atrocities and everything in very plain language. He doesn't mince words. If you look at him, he's not the most well-groomed individual, but the essence of what it is that he shares has a lot of weight behind it. Then you look at someone like Albert Einstein. He was a cross-dresser. He always had disheveled hair. He was always, you know, not the epitome of grooming, right? Again, he had a lot of substance that he offered in the work that he did, so that all of that didn't matter. So when you look at it from that perspective and you see things in that way, then you have to consider how much of effort you're putting into your appearance and your aesthetic and your image. How much of that is because you're compensating for the lack of substance? And more importantly, how distracted are you from the substance of what it is that you're doing, rather than doing it because you want people to respect you for doing it?
Yeah, lots of food for thought for that. Absolutely. Yeah, brutal honesty is required. I wanted to turn the conversation back to resistance again, because that is such a challenge for so many people. How do you go about approaching someone who is surrounded by fractured relationships? They've got this deep inner turmoil, and yet they still resist the idea of change or transformation.
People resist change because they're afraid of giving up power in some form or another. And that power is not necessarily one that suggests that they might be dominant in that space, like they might be, you know, the one in control. It's just that if I'm going to let go of what I need so that I can help them to feel better about what they need, then there's an underlying belief that if I do that, then my needs are always going to be neglected. So what's in it for me? When am I going to get my turn? When are people going to care about what I feel? And here's where it gets really difficult, and this is how we get tested through design of cause and effect rather than anything else, is that the moment we are more aware than the other person, we automatically have more responsibility than the other person. So if we hold ourselves accountable relative to our level of awareness, that makes it a lot easier to navigate. And it again, you know, it sounds like I'm just repeating myself about this accountability thing. But if you look around at the world, you'll see in our community everywhere, there's a lack of accountability for what we do. There's just this expectation, this entitlement that if I did something that I was supposed to do, I deserve something in return. There's and this absence of accountability leads us to looking at a much more important issue, which is a lack of self-respect. Because if you don't respect yourself, you're going to be transactional in your relationships. Then everything is based on, I did this, so I expect that. It's not going to be based on what is the conviction behind why you're doing it. It's everything is very, it's based on scorekeeping. If I do this, then what are you doing? And if you do that, then what are you expecting from me? And that's where the defensiveness comes in, because then if someone has a good gesture, because we are working with the assumption that, okay, well, now that you've done that, you're going to expect me to do this, and I don't want to do that because I think it's unrealistic and blah, blah, blah. Then automatically I'm going to be preemptively defensive, and I'm going to take your good gesture and turn it into a problem. You think you're better than me. You think you're always, but you don't see how much I do and all of that. And you just, you rabbit hole and you spiral in all the wrong directions because you're so busy comparing. And when you're comparing what it is that you're doing compared to someone else, and when you're comparing how you're approaching something relative to what you think others expect of you, you're just judging all the time. And that judgment becomes so deeply entrenched that you can't see the world without it. And judgment is always only the first step. It's never the last step. And unfortunately, most of us stop at the point of judgment.
Yes.
What are we going to do with that judgment? What's the purpose of the judgment? Why are we judging in the first place? You have to judge to determine whether something is acceptable or unacceptable, good or bad, right or wrong. But what then? Let's assume I judge something to be bad. What is my accountability in doing something about it? Enjoying what is right, forbid what is wrong. We need to live these values.
We don't know why we're judging in the first place.
Yeah, we're just judging because...
Is it protective now?
I think...
Are we protecting ourselves?
I think that the deeper value system that we've established as a community, and I'm saying as a community because I don't want to speak on behalf of other communities. I know the Indo-Pak community because I'm part of it, right? So I think as a community, we've established this belief that compliance with what is established as the gold standard of character and behavior, compliance with it is all that matters. And if you don't comply, then you're not good enough. It doesn't look at a natural growth towards it, aspiration towards wanting to be better and wanting to achieve those ideals. It just looks at whether you're right or wrong, good or bad, and you either shunned or you celebrated. Of course, all of that changes when you have social standing.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Right? And,
absolutely.
And the unfortunate reality about that, and this is why I'm so kind of passionate about this approach to things and this topic about accountability and labeling people and things like that, is because there's I think there was a hadith I came across that talks about how it is that the nations before you were destroyed because they would look favorably on the ones who were wealthy and the upper class of society, so to speak. And they used to punish harshly the poorer of society, the ones with less resources. And that's the problem, right? Because we're so quick to celebrate social standing and overt religious standing, we don't treat people fairly anymore. And then it becomes ego-driven without meaning to be ego-driven. And because what we're driving towards is supposed to be something virtuous, something that's supposed to be good, we don't look at how it is that we're doing it. And we don't look at why we're doing it.
Yeah, we don't. Absolutely right. Yeah. So if we have parents listening in today who are resonating with much of what you said, and they're ready to start making changes to be effective parents, as you shared with us in part 1 of the series, where do they start?
I think parents, one of the saddest things that I've ever come across when it comes to parenting is that most children have never experienced their parents outside of their parents being in crisis mode. Right? And if you think about that, it's like from the time we have our first child, for example, because of the gravity and the weight of the responsibility of raising a child, and that we go into this heavy, deep responsibility mode. And then we lose ourselves to that, but we don't realize that our children never experienced who we truly are. So the problem with that is that children have very little reason to see the human behind the role of the parent. And vice versa, the parent often loses sight of the human behind the child, because everyone's so focused on getting that role right. So if you want to change your parenting style, you don't have to adopt a new parenting technique. And please, for the love of Allah, do not go towards gentle parenting. That is the biggest nonsense out there right now. It's creating so many problems for the next generation. They are going to despise their parents for it.
So, yeah, bring me in the loop on that, because I am a mother to adult child, not small children. So, what is gentle parenting in summary about?
Gentle parenting is believing that the child has insight and understanding about everything that they want to do or need to do or have to do or did do, that they sit down and they have a meaningful conversation about big feelings and everything else. And they don't reprimand or correct. They just allow to have what it results in. It's the opposite extreme of the corporal punishment approach to parenting. So there's no middle ground. And what it does is it waters down the agency and the authority and the knowledge and the responsibility that a parent has over a child, and vice versa. So children automatically then grow up believing that they have a right to have an opinion on everything. But they don't have enough wisdom and understanding and experience in life to have an opinion that prevails on everything. They can share their thoughts on it, but the parent has to guide. You can't approach your child as if they're an equal. They're not. So we've lost the plot on this because we don't establish moderation. We don't establish a middle ground. We despise the way of our forefathers in the way they might have been too strict with us. So now we're moving towards gentle parenting, which is more liberal in mindset. And then we wonder why it is that our children just don't listen to us. Why it is that they're not taking our advice, or why it is that they don't respect us or even respect themselves. Because then we leave them to discover everything through trial and error, because we make everything optional. It's like, no, this is the way you should do it, but if you don't want to do it that way, then I'll understand, because that's your space and that's how you are as an individual. And all. It's just it abdicates accountability for our role as parents. And the problem is that there's no balance, and people don't like to hear this. A lot of people believe that gentle parenting is the way to go, but I don't know where they get this model from. It's not from the Sunnah. The Sunnah is very clear about how it is that you need to establish boundaries and establish discipline and things like that. But how you go about doing it with kindness and with understanding and gentleness, that's a different thing. But the fact is that there's still a kind of revered standard that both sides need to respect. Gentle parenting doesn't establish that. And some parents who might be getting it right, they might not actually be gentle parenting within the context of gentle parenting as it is out there in the secular world. So in that case, if they are gentle in the way they are parenting, perfect, no problem. Mm-hmm. But if you want to take gentle parenting with the way the secular perspective pushes gentle parenting, you're creating liberals who think that their opinion on things is what's more important than the essence of what it is that they're having an opinion on. And that's where we lost the plot again. And that's why I come back to that one of the things I said in the first part of our conversation about how it is that because Muslim mental health practitioners are adopting these philosophies and these principles in their advice that they're giving to their clients, they are actually inadvertently encouraging them to raise their children in a way that is going to be counterproductive to living a wholesome, grounded life as a Muslim. And that's why we're getting fractured families now, because the mainstream mental health practitioners, Muslims, are encouraging breaking of family ties and are encouraging this view of your parents are toxic and childhood trauma and all of that, instead of seeing it for what it is. Everything these days gets defined as childhood trauma. And then that belief that I had childhood trauma because I wasn't heard, that then becomes the nature with the perspective with which I look at life. And then I start behaving in a way that is reflecting that belief of trauma. And then people experience me as being narcissistic. And I stand there looking at them and thinking, you don't know how bad I had it. It has impact. And I know this is a very generalized way of framing it. But obviously this is a topic that requires a lot of hours to do justice to it. But in essence, what I'm saying is that if we're not careful, we're going to take our good intentions with our bad methods, and we're going to hold our head in our hands later on and wonder what went wrong. We have to be more purposeful in that. We have to be more engaging, more participative. We have to maintain those boundaries between parent and child and not try to be their friends, because we're not their friends and they're not our friends. And
yes, that's what Islam advocates for as well. There's always respect, there's always empathy, but we are not their friends. And there is that clear distinction and boundary between who is parent, who is the child.
And if we get that wrong in the formative years, we struggle through the teenage years and we become enemies in the adult years. And the only time you see a reconciliation of those relationships happen is after that child goes through the parenting struggles and the adulting struggles, and then they can resonate with why it is that their parents might have behaved a certain way. Which means that they're only developing empathy that late in life.
By which another entire generation has
been tainted.
Been affected.
Yeah.
And that individual, him or herself, like you said, imagine learning empathy or nurturing empathy in your 40s or 50s or 60s even. Right?
In fact, that in itself, I think, is the indictment against how we operate as an ummah, is that we do not have enough empathy. And I could argue that it's this absence of empathy that creates narcissistic behavior, and it's this absence of empathy that results in us wanting to offer a glass of water to someone who is being pummeled with bombs. Because it's all about what we are doing, not about what is needed.
What would we say to someone whose friend or spouse or child is displaying these narcissistic tendencies? How would a friend, a spouse, a child support their loved one and at the same time not lose themselves in this process?
They need to.
How do you draw lines?
I think it depends on the credibility you have with that person. If you haven't established credibility, if they don't trust you to be sincere or honest towards them, then trying to get through to them becomes that much more difficult. And unfortunately, that's the biggest problem we have in our homes, is that parents don't have credibility as advisors to their children. Social media has more credibility. So if you have that credibility, then what you need to do is just remind them about who they are and how it is that they might not be seeing themselves correctly because they're distracted by what they think others think of them, what their social standing is in their social circles and things like that. Because your self-esteem is about the esteem you place on yourself. Self-respect is about how much you respect yourself. It's not about how others treat you. And children who behave badly are usually struggling in that department, in both those, self-esteem, self-respect. So your self-esteem and your self-respect is reflected in what you make yourself available to. For example, and this is an example that I think a lot of people will be able to relate to, it's the issue of substance abuse. People that experiment with substances where they think it's purely social experimentation, the only reason they do that is because their self-esteem is low enough to make themselves available towards experimenting with something they know is harmful. If your self-esteem is healthier than that, you wouldn't want to expose yourself to that kind of harm. If your self-esteem or your self-respect is higher than that, you wouldn't want to give yourself into pornography. You wouldn't want to give yourself into lewd behavior, into all of these other vices that we are challenged with. And this is not a judgment against those who are finding themselves caught up in those traps. It's an observation that if you are struggling with those behaviors, understand that how you see yourself needs to be revisited. It's not about what it is that you think justifies your behavior because life is so tough and your partner's not treating you right and you're not getting what you need from them and all of that. It's not about that. It's about if you're not getting what you need, how you go about trying to fulfill it in an alternative way. That's a reflection of your self-respect, not what your partner's doing to you. And then that talks directly to narcissistic behavior. If I'm not going to take accountability for my own behavior, I'm going to blame others for it. And if I'm going to judge others rather than try to understand them, then that's my narcissistic tendencies. So it goes both ways.
Yeah. And if we're looking at practical steps, for someone who has realized that their behavior is hurting others, and they feel, well, I'm just so afraid to change. That fear is so all-consuming. What's the way forward for them? What's a practical step they could take?
I think that that is something that needs to be approached from both sides, right? If the person has that kind of fear, then you need to consider why is it that they don't trust the people around them to be gentle with them in that regard, right? The other side of it is that more often than not, those fears are based on experiences that happened before we got to that point in our life. And that, for example, is one of the reasons why most relationships have problems, is because of the fears and the expectations that were developed before they even met each other. So having credibility between those two parties, whether it's your partners or it's you with your family or whatever it is, that credibility has to be established on the belief that you are respected and appreciated in that space. Then to have a tough discussion about your behavior becomes easier. But if you don't have that credibility, if you don't have that respect, that mutual respect or that understanding, or you don't have a sense of fairness, let alone justice or anything else, just a sense of fairness that your efforts are appreciated and they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, so that everyone's coming to the party, so to speak. If you don't have that, then having a conversation won't go well because you're not on the same footing. The one person is trying to make you aware of how it is that you're letting them down, and the other person is trying to make you aware of how it is that your disappointment doesn't justify your behavior. So who's right? Who gives in first? And that's why the one who is more aware of what's contributing to that situation becomes the one that is more responsible for creating the space to have those discussions that need to be had.
What would you say needs to happen in the next 5 years in our schools and madrasas, Islamic schools, Muslim schools? What needs to happen for our youth to become more self-aware, to be more curious about life, about their habits, their thinking patterns, their reactivity? What needs to happen at least within the next 5 years in our schools and madrasas for this to start changing?
Oh boy, you're putting me on the spot now.
Yes, I am. I'm sorry about that, but really, it's we're really focused on the series to
Be
understand what's
solution
the
orientated.
role of, yeah, and even if if a solution sounds too simplistic, but at the end of the day, we have spoken about parenting, we've spoken about effective parenting, and then our children spend a fair amount of time every day, year in and year out, at schools and madrasas. And a great percentage of our listeners are teachers, are educators. And if even just one educator says, this is something, I'm going to run with this, and I'm going to make that change in my
Hmm.
classroom. And again, it's everyone to make the village. And the parents are part, our teachers are part of that village. What's that one thing you would hope or want to see as a change in our schools and madrasas?
Okay, let me get the the sticking point out of the way first.
Mm.
The
Sure, sure.
the one of the most concerning things that I've observed, based on my engagements with various Muslim schools and also just seeing how they conduct themselves in the general space and talking to other parents and also my own experiences with them, is that what we refer to as Islamic schools are actually secular schools with Islamic content. And we need to understand this very clearly because the entire model of how it is that we are educating our children is based on secular standards and secular principles. It's not based on Islamic principles. It doesn't talk about lived experiences, it talks about academic knowledge. So that's the first problem. Structurally, we need to revisit that entire thing. Our approach is clearly not producing the kind of leaders and adults that we are wanting in society, and we keep blaming individuals for not complying rather than recognizing that we're producing that kind of mindset. So that's the first part that I think needs to be revisited in a very meaningful, deep, critical way. The second part is something that I was contemplating a lot recently, which is kind of sad, and I also hold myself to the same kind of criticism. And that is that, there's that hadith that says something to the effect that a jannati or someone who is destined for paradise is one who, that when you look at them, they remind you of Allah. And that got me thinking, how many of our community leaders, our spiritual leaders, our ulama, our educators, and our parents, how many of them, when you look at them, not hear what they have to say, when you look at them and you experience their character, how many of them draw you closer to Allah versus how many of them make you feel judged or repulsed by their belief system? So it's not a method that we need to change. It's an experience that we need to change. And if you look around for how many of the Muslim schools, and for example, I've had discussions with Muslim faculty from multiple Muslim schools over the years, and did some workshops with a few of them as well. And I can tell you that the out of, let's just say for example, out of a room of 100 people, there would be maybe 5 that can meaningfully engage about their role as an educator. And that tells me that we have absolutely low standards of awareness regarding the impact that we have. And that's why I'm saying, if we don't like what we see in the character of the children and the young adults emerging from these Islamic institutions, if we don't like that what we see there, on the one hand we can hold them accountable for their personal conduct, fair enough. But on the other hand, we also need to understand, why is it that we keep producing that? What is wrong with the system through which they are going that is resulting in people who are extremely learned but have abrasive characters, people who are hufad and they behave in despicable manners in public?
Mm.
That conflict, that contradiction that we see in between their level of knowledge versus their character. On the one hand, again, I'll reiterate, we can hold them accountable for it because they are going to be held accountable for it. But we also need to consider, What is it about our institutions and our structure as a community as a whole? What is it about that is producing these unethical adults? And when we start having those conversations, then we stand a chance of changing it. But if we're going to keep trying to revise the syllabus and revise the structures without looking at the actual structure of the system itself and the effectiveness of the system itself, then we're just reinventing the wheel all the time and producing the same result in a different way.
Well, thank you so much for being so candid and clear and insightful. It's the experience that needs to change, and we hope and pray, inshallah, that this reaches the change makers, or the people that are seen as the change makers in society, in the schools. It should be all of us, yes, but hoping at this stage that educators and those in educational bodies are listening and are ready to take that next step forward. And I think if we're talking about it, then my hope is that there are many more who are thinking about it as well. And now we need to move from the thinking into the doing. And may that happen soon, inshallah.
Ameen.
And I think we're seeing a lot of deficiency in that regard as well when it comes to what's happening in Palestine and Gaza as well, and how we handle it and how we discuss it and how we reflect and the action that comes or lack of action thereof, isn't it?
Absolutely, and and sadly, and that reminds me of something that I experienced again this weekend, because I attended an event that was hosting a very famous speaker, international speaker that they brought to South Africa, highlighting the plight of the Palestinians. But here's the thing: not only at this event, the previous event I attended also for a similar thing, where there was a journalist from Palestine that was brought to South Africa to have an event. There's a blatant disregard for boycott products, for example. Now, if you're hosting an event to raise awareness of the plight of the Palestinians, while at the same time you're completely ignoring what is a very, very well-known call to boycott Zionist products in response to that, then what is actually driving the need to have these awareness campaigns? Are we living with conviction, or are we living with some other standard that we're trying to apply? Is it about optics? That's the new famous term that everyone's throwing around. How does it appear? Are we into optics? Or are we into substance? Because, it's sad to walk into Muslim-owned restaurants till today, 600 plus days after a genocide, apart from the 75 years of awareness of an ongoing genocide. We walk into Muslim-owned businesses and they're still selling blatant Zionist products. Blatant, right? And I don't even have to mention the names of the businesses or the products that we're talking about. But there's countless apps where you can see what is a boycott product and what isn't.
Yes.
And you'll still see people with hijab and kurtas and long beards and kufias and everything else walking into supermarkets and still taking the Zionist products off the shelf when there are clear alternatives right next to it. So we lack conscience as an ummah. And that's why we are as weak as we are. And if you look at that that's on a macro level. If you look at it on a micro level within our homes, we need to question, are we living in our homes with conscience and substance, or are we also just going through the motions? And then we'll have answers to why it is that our children are growing up so influenced by social media and everything else. Because like I said earlier, we need to understand that if as parents we don't have credibility as advisors to our children, then we need to understand that they will find credibility in other sources of advice, which is social media. We need to take accountability.
And that's something that Islam advocates for over and over in the Quran and the Hadith. And so we can't be aesthetic Muslims and yet at the core principle in the midst of a genocide, we are still continuing to support Zionist entities that are slaughtering our own Muslims, that are removing humanity from the face of earth.
Yes.
So thank you so much for bringing that up. That is absolutely important. And I don't think we have any excuse. We have all the information at hand. We have apps, we have websites. We have enough information out there to be able to make decisions that are in line with being a Muslim. So when we can start seeing that being Muslim is not just aesthetic, it's not just cultural, it is not the length of our clothing or facial hair or the width of the hijab, but it is really about making decisions that are impacting people on the ground in Palestine and their very lives.
Yes.
And take accountability for that and not sugarcoat that and say, what's the point of boycotting? Oh, it's just one product, or it's just once off. There is no such once off. And I think that sense of urgency that we need to see what's happening with this genocide is there for us. And this is really a test on us and our iman.
Yes.
Many people say, I wish I was there. I wish I was being tested there. Well, you are being tested. You're being tested through what's happening to the people in Palestine. How are you responding? How are you engaging? What are you choosing to let go of and change in your own life? So may Allah guide us in that regard, and may we always speak openly and courageously about this, inshallah.
Ameen. Ameen.
Coach, it's been such an honor to be sharing this platform with you, to learn from you, to have this exchange of ideas, and just this encouragement for us to all literally go and think outside the box and ask ourselves, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I making the choices I'm making? Why am I saying this? And rather than focusing on the judgment of others, it's to go inward and to focus on what can I do to work on myself, and how can I look at all the systems in place in my life and see what is being effective and what is not. And that requires honesty, that requires courage, that requires this deep drive to want to live as the servant of Allah and to know your identity and who you truly are. So thank you so much again for your time, for sharing with us, and for being honest and having this platform of reflection. May Allah bless you and your practice of work as well.
Ameen, inshallah, ameen.
Jazakallah khair for joining us today. Are there any closing words you'd like to share with our listeners as we come to the end of the series?
My plea for listeners is that we must please exercise more critical thinking in what we take as pervasive wisdom from what we see around us. The mainstream narratives about mental health are destroying our homes, it's destroying our marriages, our livelihoods, because we are signing up for a set of standards and cultural norms that are completely conflicting with establishing wholesomeness in society. So this absolute reckless use of labels and subscribing to this thinking of mental illness while ignoring accountability and contribution, that is, we're going to be answerable for that on the day of Qiyamah. And it's not, and saying that this is what we thought was true because psychologists told us this is not going to be a valid defense, because we have agency, we have critical thinking abilities within ourselves. And if we're not going to start holding ourselves accountable for what we subscribe to, then we're part of the problem.
Absolutely. May Allah make us all part of the solution.
Ameen.
Always. Ameen. Ameen. Coach, it's been great having you with us today. Jazakumullah khairan, and may Allah bless you, grant you afiyah, and we look forward to connecting later in the year with you again, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.